I worked in Area 51 for 15 years. What I saw beneath Level 7 will haunt you. I shouldn't have written any of this. I knew the signatures I placed on those non-disclosure packets weren't the real deterrent. What held my mouth shut for 15 years was the feeling that if the wrong syllable left my tongue, something that tracked me wouldn't just find me. It would catch up to me out of order. That unease began the night my reflection stopped obeying me. After that shift below Level 7, every mirror returned my face with a lag. I felt the way an engineer feels a misaligned bearing, a small mechanical dishonesty, a fraction of a second cough in a system designed for exact alignment. The first time I noticed it, I pivoted to close my bathroom door and watched my own jaw tighten after I had already turned. The lag was minimal, maybe a tenth of a second, but my eyes registered it as wrong, like a heartbeat that skipped and then overcorrected. They called the place underground storage. You can call anything a box, and most people will picture cardboard. I learned to picture geologic time shaved into corridors. I learned to breathe through my mouth to keep the taste of coolant out of my teeth. And I learned that silence in that facility wasn't the absence of noise, it was pressure. It pushed from the outside in, like the desert's weight above us wanted us back in the sun. This account was never meant for the chain of command. It was meant to reconcile what I logged with what I felt, to fit a human vector to data plucked out of fields we pretend we understand. I had promised myself after the last debrief and the last blood draw that I would leave it be. But memory didn't leave me. It drifted. It came back wrong. Whole stretches of those last months kept returning in my own handwriting with a pen I no longer owned. I found notes in my notebook that I couldn't trace to any sitting, equations solved in my scrawl but with steps I'd never have skipped. My name, when printed on my discharge papers, had lost an E and then found it again by the next revision. There were 2 versions of me circulating in the paperwork for a week before someone invisible chose one. If I hadn't spent my life calibrating devices to read quivering fields and faint edges of measurable reality, I might have let it slide, chalked it up to stress or age. But I trusted the part of me that counted, logged, tuned, and verified far more than I trusted any feeling. What I felt then was beside the point. What I measured wouldn't sit still. I recorded this in a sequence of nights when sleep refused to hold. I kept my phone off the ground. I removed the battery from the smoke detector because I didn't like the way its LED blink seemed to fall out of phase with the others in the room. I watched their cadence diverge by a millisecond here and there, like a choir starting to lose its timing, and I could not bring myself to ignore it. When I closed my eyes, I kept seeing the symbol that had been stamped into the metal at the end of the corridor. 3 curved lines, converging toward a point that wasn't drawn. A suggestion of a vortex, but not quite. A diagram of something that happened between points rather than at them. I dreamt it burned into the inside of my eyelids, and when I woke, I would find I had drawn it on my palm in ballpoint, an ugly, incomplete spiral of indecision. I held a coffee cup and found my hand cooler than the ceramic. I touched the window and found my fingerprint a few seconds later, arriving as if the grease in my skin had been reluctant to commit. If you've never seen your own presence separate in time, I can't explain the way it unwound me. I spent a morning trying to coax my face back into sync by moving slowly, breathing in and out at 5-second intervals. I knew how to bring clocks into agreement. I knew how to lay a grid over disparate readings and reconcile them. But this wasn't instrumentation. This was me. I might have convinced myself to swallow it, if not for the knocks. They came that first night, 12 minutes after midnight. 3 light contacts with the old wood and the pattern I had started to recognize in other places. 2 short, 1 held. I didn't open the door. I looked through the peephole and saw no one, only the angle of the hallway light shimmering the way heat does over asphalt. I put my forehead to the door and felt the echo running through it a fraction of a second late, like the building had learned my delay and was kindly reminding me. I backed away and put my phone on the airplane mode. I didn't sleep. When the sun arrived, it seemed to take a beat late to brighten the room, as if even dawn had agreed to humor my new timing. My name is Thomas Hensley. Tom, if you knew me in workrooms and cafeterias. I was the senior technician assigned to the quantum sensor array for energy containment in a facility that most people know by a nickname they throw around at bars. The name never mattered. You could have removed the numbers from every door and stamped them with fruits, and it would have been as true. What mattered were the thresholds, the badge readers that stole charge off your ID, the air handling that bleached every corridor to the same dry smell, and the way the earth settled around you when the elevator surrendered you to the lower levels. I came to the desert not because I believed in saucers or secrets, but because most places that fund exact work are governments or people who want to sell you something that won't do what they say. Our team tuned magnetometers fine enough to hear the give in an electron's spin. We ran photodiodes that would sulk if someone leaned on the table a floor above. We loved our temperaments, squid sensors that begged for temperature stability like nervous animals, cesium clocks that would drift if you didn't make a ritual of their service. On some days the work was nothing but calibrations, vacuum outgassing curves, vibration isolation checks, readouts. We ritualized until they felt like prayers murmured to keep the engines of the world from throwing a bolt. Routine stabilized me. I liked a day that could be measured out in cryostat cooldowns and slow, precise adjustments to beam alignment. My first decade was nothing but that rhythm. I had supervisors who liked my neatness, a chain of command that appreciated reports that did not speculate beyond error bars, and a set of colleagues who, like me, were suspicious of adjectives. The promotion came with the same lack of ceremony that had defined everything else. "Underground storage," someone said in a briefing, and the director tapped the map with a dry finger. It was out beyond the older dig, deeper. The lines on the plan blurred as if the cartographer had been bored. They told me I'd be monitoring energy profiles associated with inert, quarantined materials. I pictured composite armor, too exotic to leave in a hangar. I pictured pieces of whatever had made a mess of some other place in the 1950s. My job description didn't change, only the expectations. Be prompt, be precise. Report anomalies as deviations, not as narratives. "We don't write stories," my supervisor said. "We manage thresholds." The first time I descended past level 6 to level 7, my badge flashed green, with a softness that meant the software had more authority than the guard. The elevator purred, and then sighed and kept going. The numbers shifted to letters as the display ran out of space for what existed. I felt the building's ventilation change timbre somewhere between floors. The air lost the smell of filtered desert and took on a taste like cold iron and something sweet and faintly fungal, like old bread. The doors opened to a corridor that felt too long for any map that didn't admit the elastic quality of subterranean construction. The light overhead wasn't continuous. It pulsed without urgency, a gentle swell and fade that reminded me of a living organism's respiratory cycle. In my orientation, they had used words like corridor and airlock. Those terms had defined my whole career. A corridor is a corridor, measurable, countable, with a beginning and an end you can stand in. But we stepped out of the elevator into something that wore the shape of a corridor, but behaved like something else. I took a breath and held it and listened for any hum beyond mechanical. I heard something like a standing wave across a taut cable. It came and went with the light. It felt like a whisper you couldn't tune to. We passed operational doors with numbers that weren't numbers, glyphs, to be precise, or labels from a language based on curvature and interruption. At the far end of the big corridor, a gate stood flush with the wall. It had the kind of finality you only see in designs that plan for failure. If the thing had to close, it would close. The symbol on its central panel was the one that followed me, 3 bent lines, meeting toward a point they never quite reached. It had the feeling of a definition written by something that had met a concept we hadn't yet named, and had done its level best to render it for us with our paltry geometries. My duties were straightforward. I monitored an array of sensors nested around that gate and routed through a room off the main artery we called the dog leg. The equipment was beautiful in its way. Someone had spent money and time to make sure the usual departmental compromises wouldn't cripple us. The racks were clean, the fiber runs were precise. The atomic clocks in the corner had their own little climate control snuggery, and the heat rejection system ran a hum so even you could lie down in it and forget you had bones. I never asked what might be behind the gate. I asked what the sensors had been set to expect. The response didn't answer me. Transient couplings, a woman from procurement said, which meant they'd gotten their language from whatever contract pulled the gear together and didn't know what it meant beyond the bill. I had magnetic field maps from half a dozen vendor packages, interferometric layouts that would have belonged in a lab that followed textbooks, written the year I started college, and a newish set of phase tracking devices I had to learn on the fly. The only documents with non-redacted introductions were the safety materials. In the event of a pattern deviation beyond threshold, stop, capture, do not interpret out loud in the room. I kept my head down for the first month. The pulse in the corridor light resolved itself into amplitude changes over a schedule I could nearly model when I took it home in my head. The field sensors established a banal floor noise that comforted me. I put my coffee in the same corner every day. I set up my chair so I could see the gate on the feed without feeling watched by it. I told myself the odor like cold stone was simply the limestone doing what rock does when you carve it open. On a Tuesday, close to 200, while the other shifts upstairs rotated through their watch changes, the baseline refused to stay a baseline. I had the magnetometer trace feathering in a way that didn't fit any thermal cycle. Our cesium standard held, and the GPS-corrected disciplines had been long disconnected. No signals, by directive, penetrated to our depth without going through a filter so strict it made the open sky sound like mud. But the trace picked up a wobble with a rhythm that made something in my chest mirror it. I checked the HVAC. I checked for a departed tech slamming a door 3 corridors down. Everything was green. The wobble persisted, then sharpened, then stabilized into a pattern that correlated to nothing until I shifted it on the time axis and, out of frustration, dragged it backward. At minus 18 seconds, the thing snapped into correlation with a solar flare we'd see in our academics who love that kind of telemetry, a flare that hadn't been measured yet because it hadn't happened yet. I sat there with the breath never quite getting to the bottom of my lungs and watched a trace align with a future. I printed it because that was the old habit. If you don't trust the screen, put ink on something the building can't edit. I took the printout and slid it under my thigh like a school kid hiding a note and then fumbled my way to the intercom. My supervisor said words into my ear about thresholds and matched noise and systematics. I wasn't new to lying to myself, but I wasn't inclined to be lied to by a man who liked desk chairs. The trace kept its alignment for a minute and 12 seconds and then declined. When I rechecked the Ulysses feed upstairs a dozen hours later on a sanctioned terminal, the flare data posted with a timing that made my stomach get very small. I logged the anomaly. I stepped myself through the checklist for spurious correlation. I recalibrated. I wrote nothing on any form that would suggest to a bureaucrat that something in our room knew about a thing that had not yet emitted its light. I told myself that time series data was a pest, and that my gut wanted a story. All was dangerous. Still, I copied the unedited trace to a pocket drive and set a reminder no software anyone upstairs could see would parse. I could have left it there. I could have. 2 nights later, I came in to find the lag in the corridor lights had changed its phase. The fatigue in them had taken on a second harmonic. It had a hesitation I could almost hear. The gate looked like it had been cleaned. I saw a smear on its metal that had not been there the day before, and then could not swear if it had been there at all. The room had been occupied by other people. The chair's height had changed, the clock on the wall sat 1 second ahead, and my pencil had been moved to the wrong side of a notebook. My logs showed my own entries in the hour I had been asleep at home. They were correct, neatly typed, banally phrased, and wrong. It was my style, my ellipses, my reluctance to use adjectives, and not mine at once. I scrolled through the line breaks feeling a cold recognition, as if I were reading the transcript of a conversation I had in a dream. No one owned my phone at that hour. The badge system had not seen me. But there I was. That was the first night I saw the symbol appear in data instead of on metal. We had a broad-spectrum electromagnetic monitor running, not because anyone thought we would pick up radio, but because anyone who says nothing gets in a place like that is setting up an irony. The wideband plot through the usual smear until around 0317, a pattern resolved that, when rotated 90 degrees, looked like the 3 curved lines converging on the missing point. It was low power, more like a lack of noise than a signal, as if something were subtracting turbulence from the field. I saved it with the wrong file name. Intentionally, I saved it twice. When I tried to save it a third time, the capture process froze at 87%, and the progress bar stopped breathing. I watched a sliver of time wedge itself in my sternum. I could either pull the plug and risk corrupting the buffer, or wait to see if the system would exhale. The screen did neither. It held like a muscle cramp. Then the intercom cracked, and someone asked me if I had everything I needed for tonight's compliance review, and the capture window flashed and vanished. My hands felt like I had plunged them into snow. I pretended to cough. I said yes. I took a pen and drew the 3 lines on the inside of my wrist, under my cuff. When I got home at dawn, my personal email lit with a message from a sender that shouldn't have resolved. The name read, Deborah Chu. Deb died in a freeway rollover 9 months before. We had stood under the bruised strip lights of the service bay and said she was the only one who knew how to keep the faith, because that was how peeped. Her email contained 4 words. Do not drink anything. I closed the laptop like it had me. I sat and counted to 60. I opened it again, and the message had no. The timestamp remained. The subject read, Urgent. I told myself networks spit up ghosts all the time. Server scripts got confused, mail queues belched delayed and mangled content. I'd seen it. I'd debugged it. And yet I could not stop myself from opening my cupboard and sniffing the glass I had left in there the night before. It smelled faintly of soap and something like mint. I threw it away. There is a point in any strange sequence where the first aberration becomes the new baseline. You can watch it happen in labs, in marriages, in markets. I noticed myself adjusting to what I would have called months earlier unacceptable uncertainty. The lights breathed, and I let them. The gate hummed without humming, and I let it. But my data got meticulous, aggressive almost, the way you brush lint from a lapel that no one else can see. The minus 18-second offsets continued, not constant, not consistent, but stubborn. When I overlaid traces and held them up to the solar monitoring after the fact, my data was there too often to let go as chance. I kept my mouth quiet and my files crooked. I trusted cross-checks no one knew I ran. I filed a report that said, minor deviations in ambient field measurement consistent with seasonal variation in geologic stress. I wrote it like that deliberately, a SOP to the kind of mind that goes to sleep when it thinks it knows and then I kept a second set. I say that plainly now because the statute of my own cowardice is up. I had spent a career obeying the rule that we do not invent via paranoia. But what was in that corridor felt like it wanted me to normalize it until I couldn't see it anymore. I refused. I asked discreet questions about underground storage in the way you do when you already know not to be noticed. The people who knew the most said the least. The people who knew nothing said too much. I got told to update my training on MN9 protocol, which is what they called compliance events, when a person's access tripped the wrong combination of lights. The training video used harmless pastels and a flat, soothing voice. It told me to report for review if I experienced perceptual anomalies. It told me to accept neutral beverages from authorized staff only. It told me that consistency of narrative was a pillar of operational security. I watched and then walked out to a vending machine and stood and watched it blink out of phase with itself. I did not buy water. I pressed my thumb into the aluminum frame and waited for the machine to feel warm. It stayed cool where I touched it long after it should have warmed. That, more than anything else that day, made the room tilt. I brought my own sealed drinks from that point onward. I refused coffee from their pot. People noticed. Noticed is not safe in environments built to erase individuality into procedures. The nurse on duty for our level, a woman named Sergeant Lynette Parr, found me in a hall and said, "Hensley, you look lightheaded. Have you been hydrating?" And I heard a tone under her tone. I said yes. She insisted on a quick check. She took me to a small room near the elevator with a poster of desert flora. She had a tray with a capped syringe and a smile that didn't even pretend. I remembered Deborah's email, the words with their edges intact. I said I'd had a fever last night, that maybe I shouldn't get anything until after. She hesitated. People in systems do sometimes, when the other person uses the blandest form of resistance. She made a note. She told me not to work too long alone. I left feeling like I had walked a minefield without the courtesy of a map. The gate's metal felt like skin under my palm. I know how that reads. What I mean is the interface between me and that piece of steel-relayed temperature and texture and something else I wasn't trained to categorize. If you've ever held a frog you did not expect to be so warm you might understand it gave. Not visibly, not in any way I could show. But my palm told the back of my brain that the thing wasn't passive. I pulled my hand back, and my skin tingled the way it did after I touched the Van de Graaff during a school tour. I requested time with Dr. Adrian Fletcher, the physician attached to our division, because form required it and because I wanted to see his eyes when I explained the anomaly. He was a man whose desk was neat even when he pretended not to care. He liked his pen heavy. He wrote in a thin, precise hand that made my own look like an artifact from a museum about the past. I put my printed traces on his desk. I told him I was concerned about phase integrity. It was a phrase no one had taught me, but it sat right where it needed to sit. Impressive enough to make a bureaucrat not ask for definitions, vague enough to hide my fear. He slid the papers back across the desk to me, without looking at the traces beyond a glance, and said, "Those data don't exist. Restart your sensor suite." He checked his watch while he said it. He asked about my sleep. He used the word re-ambing in a way that let me know he had a list of words he rotated for trust. He wrote a note about MN9 compliance refresh. He told me to take 2 days. He told me to go outside. I looked past him through a small window at a square of sky that did what sky does without our permission, and felt something like nausea. I went back to my room. My assigned laptop had a set of logs already open. They recorded my conversation with Fletcher in terms that made me sound calmer and less precise. They did not include my phrasing. They did include a line where Fletcher said, "We appreciate your diligence," which he had not said. I closed the file without saving. I turned off the Wi-Fi. I sat on my bed and told myself to breathe. 2 short knocks came, and then 1 held knock, and I did. The knocks waited 10 seconds and repeated. I kept still and started to think. I imagined that. The knocks stopped. I waited a minute. My phone buzzed and vibrated with a calendar event I had not made, reminding me I had compliance review at 1200. I crushed the phone in my hand like that would make it schedule it. Harvey Mallon was the only person who didn't pretend. He did the kind of work that requires you to not be sentimental about pipe or wire. Keep the liquid where it belongs. Keep power where it should go. Make sure no one's collection of code got to pretend it ran the building. He had the look of a man who had loved a truck longer than most of his relationships. On the 3rd day after the flare correlation, I found him outside the dogleg pretending to patch a sleeve on an air duct. He didn't look at me. He spoke into his box like a man telling himself a story. "We didn't have this hallway 20 years ago," he said. "At least not like this. Funny." He said funny, like it wasn't. He folded his tape like a man who liked edges. I didn't answer. You learn not to answer. He finally raised his eyes to mine, and briefly, momentarily, something like relief passed between us. Not camaraderie. Our facility punished that word when it took any shape. But recognition. He said, "You'll want to check the phase clock yourself. Don't let them tell you it's fine." Then he went back to his tape. It was enough. Escalation isn't a cliff. It's a slope with gravel that looks solid until a heel skids. The 2 days Fletcher gave me did not feel like a gift. They felt like an assignment designed to put me into a space where someone had better access. I stayed in my assigned room on base long enough to make it look like I appreciated the time. Then I left. I drove out to the fence line because looking at the chain link made me feel like there was a boundary in the world that responded to force. The sun over the flats did what it did without reference to our clocks. My eyes watered for reasons that did not owe anything to sentiment. I turned my car around when a black SUV eased onto the dirt behind me and took my hint and gave me space. It didn't follow me out. It didn't have to. I returned to level 7 early for my next shift. I like an empty lab. It's one of the few luxuries people like me still trust. I checked the physical clocks first. I took the plastic guards off the faces of the little wall units and pressed the reset nubs and adjusted them according to my own watch, which I had cross-checked with a ham operator's feed I trusted more than any government-provided time. The facility's primary standard and my watch differed by less than 1/10 of a second. The corridor lights had settled into their new phase, and I tried to pretend that small mercy was a kindness. I had the room to myself for 19 minutes. In that time, I ran diagnostics on the magnetometer array and found that someone had already run them 2 hours earlier and overwritten the error logs. My account had done it. I watched a ghost version of me move through the building a step ahead of me and thought, I have to stop being so literal. I wrote a sticky note to myself that said, "You were asleep at 02:30. Prove this to yourself." I left it next to the main display where no one would look, because no one besides me would be insulted by a sticky note in a clean room. At 3:21, the signal came back. Calling it a signal gives it too much credit. It was an absence of noise shaped like intention. The broad spectrum plot resolved into smoothness where there should have been hiss. The 3 curved lines appeared again in the waterfall like a child's drawing of a river map. I rotated the display, and the symbol resolved as if it had been meant to be seen from that angle. The hair on my forearms recognized it before my rational mind allowed the recognition. The gate made a sound. The sound was not a sound the gate could make. I know how metal behaves. I know the noises that accompany pressure changes and seal failures and motors that don't love their mounts. This was a skitter behind the structure of the thing, like something moved along a vector the gate wasn't built to accommodate. The interlock panel's green scrolled through a sequence that didn't appear in any manual. The symbol on the gate seemed to gray a shade darker for a long second. I stood, my chair pushed back, and did not begin to move until I had already stepped away from it. The lag felt like a bubble slipping in a level. My stomach responded with a small revolt. I reached for the intercom to call up and stopped. If I called, I would be narrating. Narration was dangerous. I had learned that on the first day I was allowed near people who made decisions with money and guns. Instead, I clipped the little recorder to my shirt that I kept for my own habits and spoke as if to a future version of myself, unspooling this at a kitchen table. Thundrinan22 perceived signal pattern deviating symbol present in display. Interlock indicates, not sure what to call it, not in manual. Gate seems, alive is the wrong word, responsive, taking information in. I heard my own voice not quite align with my mouth. The recorder's red light fluttered in a timing that didn't suit itself. My console beeped a code I hadn't heard, and a window opened without my action prompting it. It showed a face. I blinked. It was me. No, it was a security form with my credential photograph, but the me in the little square held a neutral expression different from the one I had worn in that photo the day it was taken. It looked like a version of me telling another Tom to behave. The pop-up asked for confirmation to proceed with a diagnostic I hadn't ordered. I declined. It asked again, blankly. I declined. The third time, it accepted the no with an empty patience that put gravity in my spine. My door clicked, the audible small mechanical clack of a lock. Someone knocked, two short, one held. It was the same rhythm from my apartment. I did not answer. The knock came again, the held one drawn out for an additional heartbeat. I went very still, not because I believed stillness would save me, but because motion felt like relinquishing the last control I had. The door handle turned half an inch and then stopped at the lock's refusal. I stepped back on instinct, and my feet remembered to move a fraction after the thought, which would have been comical if it hadn't felt like a body I trusted choosing to consult someone else before obeying me. Mr. Hensley? The voice through the metal had the bureaucratic calm you only cultivate if you've been trained to keep your respiration even while saying things that ruin someone's life. This is Agent Marla Kincaid with Special Technologies. We'll need you to join us in the conference room for a compliance review. Compliance again, like a palate cleanser they kept offering between courses I hadn't ordered. Please open the door. The interlock panel for the gate drummed through a new pattern. My magnetometer trace briefly flatlined, as if something with an appetite had drunk the background noise. The three lines on the wideband plot sharpened until the display felt like it was going to bite. I wanted to look at everything and could look at nothing long enough to be a scientist. I put my hand on the console to stabilize it and felt the plastic skin of it warm under my palm and then cool as if it had been alive earlier and had now decided it wasn't. The recorder on my lapel blinked a red pattern. Pause, pause, long, long pause. I looked down and realized the blink matched the knock. Tom? The voice through the door changed tone by a half measure, softened. We can help you if you think you're experiencing an event. Open the door. People who say event are always buying themselves a width to walk through later without committing to anything now. My tongue felt dry. I swallowed nothing. I said, 1 minute, because 1 minute gave me a way to keep my voice from saying no. I pulled the drive from my console, an unmarked one that had lived in the seam of the desk for a year, and slid it into the designated port to copy the last 5 minutes of raw capture. The copy began, hung for a breath at 87%, and stayed. I stared at the bar like staring could make it Agent Kincaid knocked again, this time the unambiguous bureaucratic 3 that belonged to people with access to all the codes. I pulled the drive anyway, not caring if I lost the file. The corridor lights shifted their gentleness to a faster timing, like an organism that had decided to run. The gate exhaled. There's no other word. The change in pressure fluttered a paper on my desk and made the hairs on my arms lift and made the cheap framed clock rattle once against the wall. The interlock status lights went a series of colors I had not seen, hesitated, and then stalled as if waiting for an acknowledgement from someone not present. I opened the door because not opening it would eventually turn into something worse. Agent Kincaid stood there with a small team behind her, dressed down to look like they might be from HR, but carrying themselves like they were from something you don't put on a business card. She was compact, mid-40s, braided hair that ached to be orderly. Her eyes did the quick sweep trained people do, and then returned to mine. "Thank you, Mr. Hensley." She smiled a cutout smile, all edges clean. "Let's take a short walk." "I have active capture running," I said. "A boarding would..." And then I let the sentence drift so she could fill it with something that would cost her later if anyone played this back. "We've noted your diligence," she said. She glanced at the gate and did not visibly register that it had any category at all. People like her do not get paid to admit that gates can breathe. "This will not take long." We walked. The corridor's pulse kept time with the click of our shoes until it didn't, until it fell a half-beat behind like a child refusing to march. Kincaid said nothing until we got to the small conference room that had a table, laminate, pretending to be wood, and a camera that pretended to be a smoke detector. 2 other people took seats against the wall and performed the theater of taking notes. She laid a file in front of me and left it closed. The file already knew my finger. "We've received reports about your recent notations," she said, making the word sound like complaints without. "There's concern that you've been overexerting yourself, that you might be having longitudinal dissociation." She said the last 2 words like they had focus grouped them to be specific enough to sound real, vague enough to avoid liability. "I've submitted nothing I can't duplicate," I said. My voice sounded like the man on the recording and not like the one in my head. "If you give me 30 minutes with the suite, I can bring up a pattern right now." I felt a wash of heat moving up my back as I registered that I had offered to perform a parlor trick for a woman who didn't need to see it. "We'll review your data," she said, which is what you say when you will review the parts you already decided matter. "In the meantime, we're going to ask that you refrain from unsanctioned duplications, backups, or redundant captures. It complicates the chain of custody. You understand?" She asked it as a statement. I nodded. It cost me nothing to use the mass of my head and less to lie with it. The man against the wall who wrote in a spiral notebook wrote "compliant," as if he felt relieved to have a category to fill. Kincaid slid a paper across the table. It was a consent form for MN9 compliance protocol, the drug with the soft marketing that made it sound like a vitamin. The language explained that the compound reduced the cognitive noise associated with perceptual variance. It did not say what it did. I had read enough of the drafts of the internal research to know that the drug interfered with memory consolidation, targeted specifically to the window around an event. I could live with rough sleep. I could not live with a machine deciding which hours of my life mattered. "I'm not sure I'm a good candidate," I said. "I've had reactions to things." I let the word things carry my cowardice and my stubbornness. She watched me. She had patience that had been cultivated, not inherited. We recommend it, she said. We want you at your best. I'll sign if your doctor can point me to a placebo-controlled internal study. I knew the answer before I asked. She waited 2 beats and wrote something on her sheet that said, more about me than about any placebo. Of course, she said, which meant never. The conference lasted 48 minutes. They asked me to narrate my process. They asked me to clarify words I had used in reports. They asked me if I had been sleeping. They asked me if I had any new dietary supplements in the last month. Somewhere between those last 2, I realized that the less I gave them that they could put into their forms, the more they would fill with the thick paste of concern. I started to answer in data only. Trace correlated with the GOES 16 solar feed at minus 18.2, standard deviation over 15 minutes down to 3%. Kincaid let the small smile dry. And your interpretation, she asked. That my instruments functioned within spec, I said. She nodded like a kindergarten teacher. When they let me go, the corridor outside seemed to have stretched. I know that's not a measure. The lights had shifted again and adopted a smaller amplitude in their pulse. 2 maintenance techs I did not know worked at a panel open to the wall and did not look up as I passed. I understood, with the clarity of a man who has lost a small and specific bet, that I was now flagged. You can feel the change in the air when your status changes in a place like that. People's glances move one head width over. Doors that would usher you through now let you feel their weight. The building knows you and chooses not to. Back in the dogleg, the console had restarted itself. My sticky note had been removed. In its place, my recorder sat on the desk, its cable coiled, its red light dark. I knew I had left it on my shirt. I stood and watched its dead eye, and then plugged it into my machine to pull whatever it had caught off its little heart. The files populated neatly, dutifully, with timestamps that extended through the hour I had been in the conference room. The last file had a corrupted thumbnail that displayed as a single gray pixel in a field of white. I clicked it without breathing, and the playback stuttered through a few seconds of the wideband plot with the symbol resolving, then a sound like a breath pulled through a straw, then nothing. I went to the gate. I had thought, or hoped, or projected that something that moved just outside my coordinate system would intimidate me into the standard obedience. Instead, I felt the opposite, a contrarian, dangerous calm. If they intended to medicate me into a version capable of ignoring the lag in his own face, I had to step into the noise while I still had myself. I put my palm to the symbol very lightly. I did not expect anything to happen. The metal under my hand warmed as if I had placed it on a living thing, as if the energy moved not from me to it, but the other way. The curve closest to my thumb thrummed with a low frequency I recognized from somewhere I could not place. My watch ticked and then did not, then ticked again. I held my own breath out of a childish agreement with some animal part of my brain that thought stillness matters to machines. From the hallway, a footstep approached, light, indifferent. A man I did not know stepped in. He wore a badge that named him, but the name would not settle in my head. He looked at me, at my hand on the gate, and then at the console, and had the decency to let confusion cross his face. "You're not supposed to touch that," he said. I didn't move. He took a half step back, as if he had walked into a smell he hadn't planned to breathe. "You need to come with me," he added, but it landed like an experiment rather than a command. The gate shivered. It wasn't the gate. The corridor shivered. Something under the floor, the rock or the space we had tricked into being rock, shifted like a muscle in an animal you thought was asleep. The interlock status lights cycled through off entirely, and then came back on in unison, a first since I had started paying attention to their minor disagreements. From somewhere behind the wall came a click that was not mechanical, but had the character of a click we make when we change our minds. Agent Kincaid's voice traveled down the corridor, even and small. "Mr. Hensley, step away from the gate." I didn't turn. My palm cooled abruptly, as if something had decided we were done. I took my hand away and put it at my side, and felt the air on my skin like a reprimand. The man with the badge did not come closer. He looked as if he wanted to. I moved to the console. The 3 lines on the plot had thinned to hair, but they remained. The copy process, when I cued it again, started its progress bar and sprinted through the early percentages. It jumped to 87 and stopped perfectly, as if that number had been placed in me and now lived in the machines around me in sympathy. The door to the dogleg opened wider as Kincaid stepped in, not hurried, not slow. She glanced at the monitor, and for the first time she let her face register a small curiosity. Fleeting. "You're going to sign the consent," she said. "Campbell, it's mandatory. We can do that in your quarters, if you prefer privacy." "Is this an order?" I asked, because I needed the words. "It's a necessity," she said, which is what you say when you want to use a softer word than order, but mean the same thing. Behind her, the corridor lights accelerated and then stalled, the pulse going ungainly. Adolescent. The gate's seam at the floor changed its shadow by a degree that would not show on any camera, but that my eye could not ignore. A sound began, small and precise, as if someone were tapping a fingernail on glass very far away. It came regular, and then altered by a single beat, and then resumed. I wanted to say, "It's learning," but my mouth had the good sense to stay closed. I nodded again, not in agreement, but because my head understood that sometimes it buys you seconds. Kincaid took it for yes, and relaxed a sliver. She stepped aside to let me pass. I reached for my recorder, out of reflex, then left it, because taking something is often the quickest way to guarantee that someone takes it from you. I straightened the paper I had left crooked, and because I did that absurd human thing, I was still there to witness the interlock panel's lights flip in a sequence that did not belong to any human design. The seam at the gate's edge widened the width of a human hair and then settled, and then opened again the same width, and then again a double. The corridor made a noise like a throat catching. The man with the badge said a syllable and lost the rest. Kincaid turned as if she had felt a draft. There was no draft. The air decided to be thicker. The line at the bottom of the gate admitted a roller of shadow, darker than the rest of the shadows, like an absence moving as an animal moves when it wants to remain unmeasured. I watched it and thought, I have nothing in my training for this. I took one step back at last, and the step caught up with me after its own small consideration. My reflection in the black of the monitor lagged a fraction longer than usual, and then overtook me by a hair, which I'm aware makes no sense at all. A knock sounded on the metal behind us, 2 short, 1 held. It came from the other side of the gate. Agent Kincaid's composure thinned. She looked at me, and then at the gate, and then at the man with the badge, and made a little calculation in the corner of her mouth. "We're done here," she said, as much to the room as to me. "Mr. Hensley, come with me now." The lights overhead slipped half a cycle out of time with one another, like a row of mismatched hearts, and the progress bar on my aborted copy drew a single pixel more and stopped. I agreed to walk with Agent Kincaid because refusal would have put a lot more hands on me than I had the energy to fight. She didn't touch me. She didn't have to. Her proximity was enough to make the corridor feel narrower. The 3 others behind her split their attention between my posture and the living pulse of the lights, like they were juggling 2 metronomes. We took the long way up, which in that building meant the way without windows. On level 4 we passed a room with a glass pane you could not see through despite its pretense at transparency. The camera in the corner angled down the smallest degree so that anyone who cared about angles could feel the attention. Kincaid kept her eyes level. She didn't speak until we were in the small med room with the Desert Flora poster again. The same nurse, Sergeant Lynette Parr, set out a tray. She had replaced the capped syringe with a paper cup holding a pill the size of a sesame seed. She spoke with a practiced lightness that made something in me go cold. Just helps with the cognitive noise. I looked at the pill. I looked at the water cup beside it. The cup's surface showed a slight tremor that did not match the vibration in the building. I had a reaction last time, I said, which wasn't true because I hadn't taken anything last time. Kincaid nodded as if she remembered. We'll dose low, she said. You'll be monitored. We're not trying to impair. We're trying to protect your function. The word protect lodged in my ear like grit. Protect from what? I asked, and Lynette did that small nurse's smile that puts nothing at stake and everything on you. Kincaid didn't answer. She slid the consent form closer. It was the same form with the same soft language about perceptual variance and narrative consistency. There was a line for an emergency contact. The space stood empty. I signed nothing. I'll take a baseline test, I said, because baseline is a word that makes people feel you don't want to be trouble. Of course, Kincaid said. Lynette handed me a pen with a logo from a contractor we all pretended wasn't there. I printed my name. The ink showed up an instant after the nib moved. Not enough to make anyone else notice, plenty for me to feel the small shift in my stomach. The door behind us clicked. Someone knocked. Two short, one held. Kincaid didn't react. Lynette put her hand over the paper cup in a gesture that was more protective than she intended. The knock didn't come again. The air handler made a modest cough. Kincaid slid the form back. She didn't say anything about the empty signature line. We'll proceed with briefing, she said, and we all acted as if any of us had been briefed on anything that mattered. The briefing room had a table with the fake wood laminate and a monitor patched to a network that acted like it had never met the rest of the building. It displayed a static slide with an emblem for special technologies that I had never seen before. The emblem wasn't the 3 lines. It was a tasteful, non-committal shape that meant nothing. There were 4 of us, Kincaid, me, a man who introduced himself as Captain Eli Morrison, a rank meant for comfort, and Dr. Lila Voss. Voss had the soft hands of someone who annotated PDFs for joy, and the eyes of someone who had been told she was too young to lead and had done it anyway. She was listed as Communications Systems, which in our house meant, don't ask, we route everything. She took the seat opposite me and didn't hide the way she studied my face. You've been seeing the symbol in your readouts, she said, not a question. We've been seeing it too. Kincaid shot her a look that said, we don't start there. Voss ignored it in the way only someone with a mandate can ignore a look. I reached out to you because of the way you log, she said to me. You don't backfit. I can use that. Morrison leaned back as if a chair could be a shield. Kincaid folded her hands. That symbol, 3 curved lines converging, is not random, Voss went on. But it's not exactly a symbol either. It's a condition. It shows up when a field is being smoothed out just in front of a perturbation. Think of it like the quiet that happens in a room before a sound you can't hear yet. Only the quiet has structure. You have a model, I said, trying to keep my... I have a hypothesis, she replied, which was the answer I wanted and didn't. And the minus 18-second alignment, I asked. You've seen that too. Voss nodded once, slow. Not all was 18, sometimes 16.9, sometimes 19.1, but clustered. And if you get cheeky and treat those offsets as coordinates in a transform, don't, Kincaid cut in, a human hand placed over the mouth of a faucet. We are not speculating in a way that becomes actionable. Voss flicked her gaze at Kincaid's hand and then back to me. The flick wasn't insubordinate. It was resigned. We don't think we're dealing with a transmission, she said. We think we're dealing with coupling across a boundary that isn't a wall. A time boundary, I said, tasting the stupidity of how it sounded and doing it anyway. A phase boundary, she corrected. Time is our column heading. It's not their medium. She didn't say who they were. She didn't say it like there was a they. She said it like there was an it. Morrison cleared his throat like a man politely announcing his own presence. The operational posture is containment, he said. We do not interact with the source. We do not acknowledge in our systems that there is a source. We watch for leaks. We increase thresholds if we have to. He said it the way a man says, the river will flood, so we will stack sandbags higher. Leaks into what? I asked. Into us? Into you, Voss said. She didn't mean Tom Hensley specifically. She meant people who measure too long next to a boundary they can't name. Kincaid slid a folder across the table. It contained photocopies of log excerpts that weren't mine and were mine. The dates bent around one another like someone had shuffled a deck of days. A name repeated across the headers, Deborah Chew. I didn't touch the folder. Kincaid watched my face to see what the name did to it. She worked in your division, Kincaid said. She worked on phase lock fidelity. She was reassigned to a different division. The way she pronounced reassigned laid a blanket over an unsaid. You received an email from her after she died, Kincaid said. So, the server logs told you, I said. Or did I imagine a server too? Voss leaned forward. She didn't look like she had the habit of leaning forward for anyone. What did the email say? She asked. Her eyes were intent without threat. It was terrifying, the relief that moved in my chest. I told her. Do not drink anything, 4 words that had not deserved to make me feel like I had been given a rope. Voss sat back and let that sit in the room. Our first contact protocol for cross-phase communication attempts included a constraint on ingestion during capture, she said. We didn't publish that internally. We didn't put it in training. We wanted to control the variable. So she told me something that she shouldn't have had permission to say, I said, and felt a small, perverse warmth at the thought that Deborah had cheated even the deadness assigned to her. Or a future condition told you what your system needed to hear to maintain isolation, because she was honest to the point of cruelty. We don't get to assign agency just because our fear likes a face. Kincaid stood. We all stood because that's what you do when the person who signs for your hallway stands. You will continue with your duties, she said to me, as if there had been a question. You will not duplicate. You will not export. You will report if you experience perceptual variance. You will accept cognitive stabilization, dosing under MN9. That is mandatory. Voss didn't look at her. Don't take it tonight, she said to me quietly, like a grant application she knew would be rejected but couldn't not write. I need clean data. Kincaid looked at Voss then. I expected reprimand. She didn't offer one. She let the silence do it. She walked me back to level 7 personally, which was a message in itself. When I returned to my suite, the recorder's red light gave a tiny apologetic blink and died. The console booted into a clean login prompt, resigned. The sticky note remained missing. The shame of caring about the sticky note was disproportionate. None of the people with badges would understand why the absence of a cheap piece of paper made the room feel evacuated of meaning. I sat. I adjusted the chair back down to my height. I started the sensor suite and watched the bass line reassemble itself like a patient humming the same old song it hummed when no one asked it to sing anything new. At Ojo 315, the broad spectrum plot smoothed. The 3 curved lines appeared without needing rotation. The interlock panel ran a tight series of acknowledgments without corresponding cause. I spoke into my own recorder, my voice calm because panic would only contaminate the way I read the panel later. Row 315, phase smoothing. Interlock not in manual. No command issued. I reached for the copy routine. The progress bar climbed and then hesitated at 87%. I felt my pulse slide into its groove. And then, for the first time, the bar ticked to 88, 89, 91. I didn't breathe until it hit 100, and flashed the small, dumb, square celebration no one would ever see. I ejected the drive and put it in the seam of my desk, an old habit, and then abandoned the habit and slipped it into my sock. I looked at the monitor and let myself for one beat consider the absurdity of a man in one of the most secure places on earth hiding a thumb drive like a child hides a candy. I didn't laugh. The knock came from the gate, two short, one held. I turned. The seam at the bottom of the gate widened the width of a fingernail and then settled, as if it had indulged itself. The air density changed the way air density changes before a storm. I understood that if I called Kincaid, she would walk in with the same patience, and I would be lowered like a frog into a pot that would never quite boil. "I'm listening," I said, and I said it aloud, not because I believed something needed sound to hear me, but because I needed to hear my own voice, and I needed the room to know that I had declared a line. The ally you want is the one who refuses to believe you. The ally you get is the one who has already seen too much to be useful to either of you. Voss came to my lab that night with her badge clipped inside her shirt, so that she had to fish for it like a child with a frog. She didn't knock. She waited for me to notice the shape of her in the doorway, an agreement we made without speaking to not add more rhythm to a room already full of rhythms too many. "I recalculated your offsets," she said, stepping in like she had always had permission. "You're not going to like what they're doing." "I already don't," I said, and then softened the words with a lift of the hand. "What's your transform?" She held up a small pad of paper, an affectation in a building that had killed handwriting with dignity years ago. It felt like a rebellion I could love. On the paper, numbers arranged in a grid that would have been elegant if it weren't an accusation. If you treat the offsets as an address into a map of the lab's physical layout, you get you. "Cute," I said, because I needed to make the thing smaller with my mouth or I would let it get too big in my ribs. "Everything maps to something if you let it," she said, unrolling more of the paper, night over night. "When you're not here, it maps to the chair where you are while you're gone." If I were sentimental, I'd say it was pointing. "Pointing at what?" I asked. "At the thing that keeps asking," she said, "at the mouth that feeds signals." I wanted to argue. I needed to. What came out instead was Deborah. Voss let the name be a sound in the room. "She asked the wrong way," she said. She thought it was smart to push noise at a thing that removes noise. It took the noise out of her. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the gate. "You told me not to take the dose," I said. "I told you I needed clean data," she corrected, so I would not mistake honesty for affection. "Also, the compound flattens the very variance I'm trying to measure. They call that safety. I call that throwing away signal." "What's your mandate?" I asked, half wanting her to say the word safe and make me feel childish. "Decode enough to make the right people stop breaking it," she said. "Or prove that the only safe thing is to bury it deeper and pray we didn't already become part of its boundary condition." The way she said pray was a man taking apart a radio and finding a prayer written inside the casing in pencil from the factory. I didn't tell her about the drive in my sock. I didn't need to. She had a way of looking at the edges of things that you'll seen backwards. "If you were to try to send something out," she said, casual, like a woman asking if I liked my coffee black, "you know the fiber in this room runs through a passive splitter that the inventory says doesn't exist." "Of course it does," I said. "And it goes where?" "To the old antenna farm that got decommissioned because it was funny to take pictures of from space," I said. "But the farm never minded a midnight snack." "You want me to feed it?" I said. "I want you to leak nothing and change nothing and do nothing," she said, too loud to be misunderstood if anyone was listening. "But if your baseline catches a burst and you find your copy process mysteriously completing, and you accidentally leave an endpoint exposed, and you mistakenly ping the wrong host with a packet that happens to be formatted like a heartbeat, and an old dish hears a whisper on a frequency no one has permission to hear anymore, and an old ham in the desert writes down a time and a set of numbers in a notebook no one will ever read. She stopped. She looked at me. Then at least there would be a copy outside of their paper shredder. My throat felt dry. The paper cup on my desk sat where I had put it to remind myself not to drink. The water in it looked wrong, not shimmering where it should. Then don't repeat them, she said. Her voice was flat. She put a small piece of paper under my notebook. If I were you, she said louder now, I would comply with all protocols and take all my pills and report all my dreams. She turned to go. In the doorframe, she paused without performing the pause. You're lagging more than you were, she said. Don't touch the glass. Then she left as if she had never been there. I lifted my notebook and looked at the paper. It held 3 numbers formatted like a server address, and a frequency and a time. The time was 6 minutes from now. The gate murmured. The interlock panel blinked a pattern I hadn't yet seen. My chest felt like someone had set an instrument in it and been too lazy to tune it to the rest of the band. I didn't deliberate. Deliberation lives in the time you don't have. I pulled the drive from my sock and slid it into the console. The capture routine had a file waiting in a temp folder that looked like it had been embarrassed by its own concealment. I packaged the file with 3 others that contained the 3 lines, rotated and unrotated. I stripped the metadata. I opened a terminal and typed in the numbers. The cursor blinked like a throat. I sent a first small packet, hello in a language that had no vowel and note. I watched the routing timeline elongate and threatened to drop the connection, and then the dish on the hill I had loved when I was a younger man and wanted to believe in hardware lifted its face a fraction of a degree that no human eye could measure, and received a mouthful of what I had pushed. The console's network monitor flicked to a window I had never seen. It asked me if I would like to authorize off-grid redundancy. The word redundancy made a small laugh move in my diaphragm, and stay there. I authorized. The progress bar jumped to 80, 87, 91. It completed. The file went. I felt the unkind joy of a man who has cheated a test he always hated. The door handle turned behind me, 2 short, 1 held, and then a key that belonged to someone who never knocked. Agent Kincaid stepped in. She didn't look at the console. She didn't need to. She held a folder the weight of which was an accusation that she pretended had no target. "We're going to your quarters," she said. "It's time for your dose." "Of course," I said and stood. My legs were slow by a fraction that hurt to notice. On the monitor, the symbol thinned and vanished like an animal tucking its tail. The interlock panel settled into a pattern that would have made even the old training video yawn. We walked. The corridor hummed in a key I had learned like a language I never wanted. The elevator exhaled the kind of breath that makes you think of lungs even when you know there are none. We stepped into my assigned room, and Kincaid performed the politeness of letting me go first to show that I had dignity. Lynette came a minute later with the paper cup and the sesame seed pill. "Hydrate," Lynette said, and her tone was neither coaxing nor cruel. "You will feel steadier." "Promise?" I said, and heard in my mouth the cadence of a child who has never been believed. "Promise," she said. I took the pill. I placed it on my tongue. I put the water to my lips. I tilted it. I let the water touch my tongue, and then I let it out of the side of my mouth. I let the pill sink under my tongue, where I could crush it later. It was a petty act. It wasn't safety. It was a small line I could draw in a room that papered over lines. Kincaid watched my throat. "You don't have to be brave," she said. She meant, "I'm tired," I said, which was true on at least 2 axes. "I'll sleep." She nodded, an equivalence accepted. "We'll check in," she said. Lynette gathered her tray and gave me a look that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite respect. The door closed. I sat. The pill sat under my tongue like a pebble. I spat it into my palm and rolled it into my sock with my thumb drive's warmth. On the nightstand, my facility phone blinked with a new message that had managed to populate despite airplane mode. The sender read, Deborah Chew. The subject line read, Don't. The body contained characters that did not belong to any alphabet I had studied, not glitched, not corrupted. The characters curving toward a point that wasn't drawn. The building sighed. The knock came at my door, two short, one held. I did not move. The knock repeated. I put my finger to the peephole. The hallway on the other side lagged a fraction second behind my breath. There was a version of this story where the men and women with the folders are the villains because it pleases a tired instinct to assign all the cold to one set of hands. That version did not survive my next 3 days. The doses I didn't take said less about me than about the layer of the building that had decided to treat us all like we were frayed conductors that needed tape. The thing behind the gate kept making its small requests, and the building kept insulating. I stood in the seam with my own insulation held in a sock and felt like a man playing electrician in a house the ocean wanted. Voss found me in a corridor that bent at a right angle you could not measure. She walked as if every step had already been rehearsed by someone who had died doing it. "We got it," she said. "Your packet made it out. We heard a response." "What kind of response?" I asked. My mouth was dry in a way that water would not fix. "The absence of noise shaped like intention," she said, and smiled because she knew the phrase was a joke on both our skulls. 3 smooth channels, the symbol but more explicit, like it knew it had the full width of the pipe and decided to use it. "What did it say?" I asked. "I told you not to go for say," she said, gentle. "But if I had to ruin it with a word, it said, stop." "Stop what?" I said. "Stop sending? Stop touching the gate?" "Stop us?" "Stop smoothing the field," she said. "There's a threshold. They're using it like a glass. We're wiping it with our broad hands and thinking we're cleaning, and they're losing their reflection." I hated the image. I loved it. "We're the noise," I said, and heard Deborah's 4 words as something crueler. Do not drink anything had perhaps not been about poison. Perhaps it had been a way to tell me to not add to the medium. Voss lowered her voice. "We were never meant to be their boundary." "Morrison will bury this," I said. "Morrison is the bury," she said without heat. "He's the sandbag. He was hired to be the sandbag. I like him. I want him to live. I want you to live. I want the part of me that wants answers to shut up long enough to not crack a glass." I should have felt gratitude. I felt cornered, the way you feel when someone puts their hand on your chest to keep you from stepping into the street, and you still resent the hand because you wanted to be a person who didn't need it. "What's the play?" I asked. I meant, what do we do to tell ourselves we did something? "We close the gate tighter," she said. "We turn off the suite. We unplug the dish. We kill the rooms upstairs that talk to rooms we pretend we don't have." She looked past me to the wall where the drywall tried to pretend it was limestone. "We are not going to do that," she said. "We're going to pretend to do that and then pretend to observe the results and then actually watch something else." I didn't bother asking what the something else was. The building chimed once with the tone it used for a fire drill. It always whispered, "We would never actually have." Voss flinched the smallest degree. "That's them," she said. "That's upstairs pretending to be a drill so we all move into the posture they want while they move a box." "What box?" I asked. She didn't answer. The chime came again. Morrison's voice came over the intercom with the calm of a man reading the side effects of a new drug at the end of a commercial. "All personnel, this is a compliance exercise. Please remain in your work areas. Do not move between divisions." Await instruction. I did not remain in my work area. Remaining was for men who liked their pulse where it sat. I moved lightly, deliberately, upstream of the flow. The hallways had the empty quality of a school in summer. I passed closed doors with labels that pretended to be numbers and opened into rooms that didn't exist. I found the stair that only service used because it complained and used it. On level 3, I saw 2 men in street clothing with the posture of men who hated their shoes walk a metal case the color of a lie. They did not look at me. The case was not heavy enough for a thing that mattered. That was how I knew it mattered. "You're not supposed to be here," a voice behind me said, and I turned to find Harvey Mallon. He looked tired in a way that wasn't sleep debt. The skin around his eyes had learned a new, unpleasant arithmetic. He put his hand on the railing to steady himself, and I saw the slight tremor in his fingers. "They told me you retired," I said, and it came out like a joke I knew wasn't funny. "I did," he said. "Twice." He allowed himself the smallest smile. "You've been promoted to difficult." "Did you pick the lock from the other side?" I asked. "Or did it pick you?" He glanced at the door with the same old suspicion he reserved for any machine that did not put its wires where a man could reach them. "You seeing the lag?" he asked, as if we were talking about a video feed on a slow network instead of a body. I nodded. He nodded back once. "Don't touch the glass," he said, same phrase as Voss, which meant someone had written it on a wall somewhere in permanent marker, and the message had traveled by hand to people too stubborn to forget. "What's in the case?" I asked, not expecting an answer. "Don't ask like you're a reporter," he said, fond without wanting to be. "You ain't. You're a man who counts. There are tests you can build into a corridor to know if a building is lying. You can drop a washer and count the time it touches each step. You can lean into a corner and listen for the echo's return and how it thickens. I didn't have a washer. I had the small knuckles on my hand and a wall. I tapped 2 short, 1 held. The wall answered me with the tiniest delay, and something in the building that listened answered without a wall at all. Harvey heard it. His eyes softened the way men's eyes go soft when they let a fear in, just long enough to allow for the correct respect. "What if it's not an it?" I asked. "What if it's us at a phase offset we don't have instrument for yet?" "It still eats," he said. "You feed it, it learns how you smell. You don't want something knowing your smell that can meet you early and late." He put his palm up to the wall and then took it away like the wall had licked him. We heard feet. We moved like men who had remembered they were organs in a bigger animal. We stepped into a service alcove and became pipes. 2 agents walked by, Kincaid at their head, a clipboard like a flag. She did not glance in. She did not need to. The men with the case turned left. Kincaid turned right. The building felt for a moment like a map I could hold. Then the map folded in a way maps shouldn't. "You know why they dose you," Harvey said, the words landing like he'd practiced them and hated the practice. "It ain't to make you docile, it's to make you stay. You slide a little, you catch on a ridge, the pill sands the ridge. You don't catch, you don't get pulled." "Pulled to what?" I asked. "To where you already went," he said, and nothing he had ever said about any gasket had ever sounded so sure. I carried that sentence back down to level 7 like it weighed more than the thumb drive in my sock. The gate waited with its same pretense at passivity. The symbol did not change. The interlock panel pretended to be a Christmas tree. Voss's terminal sat with a small script idling, a heartbeat that could be mistaken for compliance. I sat. I watched the baseline. At Oro 302, earlier than usual, the smoothing began. The 3 lines smoothed, thinned, sharpened. The wideband plot lost its hiss, like someone laid a blanket over the world. I didn't touch anything. I kept my hands in my lap. I breathed evenly like the training video would have liked. The gate exhaled again, the small draft that isn't a draft. The seam widened. A shadow moved in it, a shadow that wasn't a shadow. The first time I saw it, I thought my eyes had made noise. The second time I realized it moved when I didn't, and refused when I reached for a pattern. "Stop," I said, and I meant it not as a plea, but as an instruction to myself. I meant, Stop smoothing, stop narrating, stop becoming the medium. I took my own advice. The plot regained hiss, the 3 lines blurred. The interlock panel returned to a human-approved sequence. The seam narrowed until my eye had to pretend it had not been wider. The knock came again. 2 short, 1 held, but this time on my desk. I looked down. The recorder had shifted where it sat, the red light cycling a pattern I had not programmed. I slid the recorder into my pocket and forced myself to not check the drive in my sock for reassurance. Outside the door, a voice I recognized and did not want to hear called my name. Dr. Adrian Fletcher. He hadn't visited Level 7 since he had told me my data didn't exist. "Tom," he said, "open up a second." I opened the door because not opening doors was starting to feel like the biggest risk. Fletcher looked like a man who had slept in his car between shifts. He held a file he didn't need, and a pen he didn't need, and the nervousness of a man who had cheated on something larger than a test. "Walk with me," he said, "just for a bit." We walked the corridor the long way in the opposite direction from the gate. He didn't say Kincaid's name. He didn't say Morrison's. He said, "They brought me in because your MN9 shows as administered and not metabolized." I said nothing. He looked at my face like it was a printout with a bad font. "You're making this harder than you think," he said, and he didn't mean it, like a threat. "Your lag, there are ranges where it's reversible without intervention that removes too much. If you keep skipping your dose, you will not be reliable to yourself." "What's your definition of reliable?" I asked. "Being able to step into a room and know that the room is the version of the room you left when you closed the door," he said. "I'm a coward. I want that." "So do I said. "Then for God's sake stop talking to the space under the gate," he said, and blushed, as if God had been a word too intimate for him to use. "Take the pill. Tie yourself to your own rail. Don't be noble. Nobility is what gets people like us killed courteously." I stood with him at the end of a corridor that curved like some architect had had a theory about keeping people from feeling like they were underground. "You think you're protecting me," I said. "I know I am," he said, and he was probably right. That was the worst part. I went back to my suite. I took the pill out of my sock. I rolled it between my fingers until it disintegrated a little. And even then I could not decide if the right thing to do was to swallow it or to open the recorder and feed it to the gears. I put it on my tongue. I swallowed without water. I sat and waited to feel like a man again. I noticed the room's corners and how their angles agreed. I noticed the window's fake sunlight in its fake dawn cycle. I noticed my breath and how it entered my chest on time. I stood to check my face in the mirror and found the mirror clear. I smiled on purpose. The smile smiled back in sync. For 3 hours, I lived a useful lie. It was the nicest 3 hours I'd had since the gate loosened a hair. It held until the facility phone vibrated against the nightstand with its own lag. The message read, "Deborah Chu, you stopped." The body read, "Thank you." It added a symbol that was almost the 3 lines, but not quite. A new curvature like a hand that forgave the first. I wish I could end there and tell you, I obeyed the rest of my contract with reality. It doesn't go like that. The line I drew with the pill was as crooked as every line I'd drawn before. The dose gave me a vector. It did not give me peace. The lag subsided until it chose not to, and the choice felt personal, because we are vain animals and interpret all weather as message. For 2 days, I did not feed the dish. I sat in Level 7 and let the noise live. Voss disappeared into rooms that had no signage. Morrison ran drills you could smell as drills, even if you were in a coma. Kincaid stood in doorways in the way women stand when their training makes architecture. Fletcher sent messages couched in the gentle, weaponized courtesy of a man who knew my blood chemistry better than. Lynette handed me water and watched to see if I ink. Harvey avoided the camera's gaze and patched a duct that didn't need patching. We all pretended. On the third night, the gate sighed in a way you could have mistaken for rock settling if you had not trained your ear on rock long enough to know it had settled hours ago. The seam widened farther than before. The interlock panel lit an impossible color, not impossible to the human eye, just impossible to the manufacturer's palette. The wideband plot smoothed, then over-smoothed, and the 3 lines were replaced by a 4th shallow curve that did not belong to any of our catalogs. My recorder turned itself on, which should not have been possible. It captured the room's hum and my breath and the tiny scratch of my thumbnail against my palm. I said aloud, 0301, new curve. 4th inflection, interlock, doing unlisted sequence. I reached for the intercom. I didn't press it. I put my hand back in my lap. The gate did not open. It moved through itself. The metal behaved as if it were being redescribed by a mathematician who didn't like our nouns. If you've ever watched a mirage form on asphalt and doubted your eye, even as it told you the road was liquid, you know the sensation. The symbol on the gate grayed, sharpened, grayed again like a heartbeat. Something came into the seam and did not come into the room. It didn't crawl, it didn't flow. It occupied a set of instants that didn't correspond to the instance where my body belonged. When it crossed the line where my eye had decided the seam ended, every hair on my arms lifted in synchrony with the half-second lag I had learned to hate and then live with. My reflection in the monitor smiled a split second after I did not. I thought of Fletcher's rail, Kincaid's necessity, Voss's glass, Harvey's smell. I did the only thing that felt like not an act of war. I stopped breathing for 5 counts. It's embarrassing how little. The smoothing relaxed. The 4th curve subsided. The gate brightened the smallest fraction. The seam did not narrow. It just stopped asking for width. Morrison's voice dropped an octave. All level 7 personnel, hold position. You only say hold when you intend to move everyone anyway. I remained in my chair as if obedience would make me less interesting. The recorder in my pocket knocked. 2 short, 1 held. Outside my door, feet approached in a rhythm I had learned enough of to resent. Kincaid entered without pretense of knocking. Voss was behind her, uninvited and unrepentant. Morrison filled the doorway like a barrier. Fletcher arrived late and looked like a man who had just gotten off a phone call with himself. "Do not move," Kincaid said, and then added, "Please." I wasn't planning on it, I said. Voss didn't look at me. She looked at the gate with the same hunger she pretended she didn't have at our briefing. "It showed a 4th, she said softly. "It stopped when he stopped." "We moved to hard containment," Morrison said. He might as well have placed a sandbag on each of our chests. "We're sealing level 7. We're cutting power. We're isolating phase instrumentation. We're—" "At least ask why it asked us to stop," Voss said, turning to him with a patience that could read as insolence if you were drunk on authority. "At least ask what our action creates as condition on the other side." "There is no other side," Morrison said, not because he believed it, but because his paycheck required the phrase. "There is a source. There is us. We keep us from leaking into source." "That's the shape." Kincaid looked at me with an expression that did not belong to any of the forms she had filed. "Thomas," she said, my name unusually careful in her mouth, "tell me what you're experiencing right now." "Nothing," I said, and it was almost true. "I'm trying very hard to not be a medium." Her mouth tightened to hide a response. "Good," she said. "Maintain that." The lights shifted up to full bright like a hospital making its false morning. The interlock panel went honest. Red, red, red. The symbol on the gate didn't vanish. It thinned until it was almost a scar, and then sat, waiting. Kincaid spoke into her lapel. "Begin phase 1. The building responded in ways I had never seen it respond because I had never been awake when it did. The air handlers stilled. The hum of the suite flattened. The room's sounds took on a hollow quality, like a room after all the furniture has been moved. The gate did not change. It remained indifferent to the way we turned the desert into a pretend submarine. Voss drifted to the console without asking. Her hands moved without touching. "We cut noise," she said, half to herself. "We might have cut our ability to see them." "That's the point," Morrison said. He looked at me over Kincaid's shoulder, and briefly, surprisingly, his eyes included me in his concern. "We're trying to keep you from seeing something you will follow out of duty." It took me a heartbeat to understand that he meant it as compliment and caution both. "Maybe that's the inversion," I said, and the room let the word hang without punishing me for being a man who put a word out with too much shape. "Maybe the enemy you've been burying is trying to keep you safe." Kincaid's eyes did a small calculation. "And the friend?" "The part in us that needs to know," I said. Fletcher exhaled like a man who had been holding a weight on his diaphragm. "We're all arguing in metaphors because none of us can describe this without making fools of ourselves. Tom, take the dose tonight. If you pull too far, we can't bring you back without cutting too much. The other side is not a place you can live. It's a way of being at the wrong slope, in a room that has no floor." It was an odd mercy. He made the danger unseductive. None of his words glamorized the place bait. He made it a physics problem again. He let me hate it. "I'll take it," I said, and for the first time I meant it without trying to figure out how to cheat. I wanted the rail. I wanted to be the man whose mirror returned his face at the right time, unremarkable and forgettable. "Good," Kincaid. Relief loosened her shoulders. "We're going to move you off level 7 while containment proceeds. You're going to erase my access," I said. I wanted to say it aloud so it would be a mark in a room that had erased so much good data already. "We're going to keep you alive," she corrected, and for once I believed that both sentences were the same. They walked me out past the gate that pretended to sleep. The corridor lights pulsed a little faster, like an anxious breathing that had decided on exertion. We reached the elevator. The doors opened. The car sat empty like a mouth expecting something sweet. I stepped in. The others did not. "We'll meet you on level 3, Kincaid said. "There's a detour we have to take." The doors closed on her face before I could decide whether to call that move tactical or kind. The car began to rise. It rose 1 floor. The lights in the car did not go out. They changed color as if the air around me had chosen a new spectrum for a hobby. The floor shivered with a patience that had nothing to do with cables and counterweights. I stood very still. My mirror in the brushed steel by the door watched me with a delay that returned after the pill like a dog finding its way home. The car did not open on level 3. It opened on a landing that did not correspond to any map I had been allowed to see. The corridor ahead had no pulse in its lights. The air smelled like ozone and old varnish. It had the feeling of a place you visit in dreams about schools from your childhood. Familiar, wrong, a little wet around the edges. Somewhere down that corridor a soft tapping sounded, regular, indifferent to me. 2 short, 1 held. I could have stayed in the car. I could have pushed buttons like a man pushing on the chest of a stranger and hoping to hear a heart. I stepped out. The doors closed behind me with an unkind confidence. I took 3 steps onto a floor that had a wax shine and scuffed like a hallway no one had used and everyone had. Stopped. The lights did not pulse. My head felt clear. My chest felt like it had too much air. I don't know how long I stood there. Time did not announce itself, and I had not brought a watch I trusted in places like that. When the elevator behind me finally opened of its own accord, I stepped backward into it like a diver who had decided to trust the surface again. The doors closed. The car moved. When it opened, Kincaid waited on level 3 with Lynette and Fletcher, and a small plastic bracelet that would place me back into a system that could find me. "You took long," Kincaid said. It was as close to fear as she allowed herself. "The car stopped," I said, and then didn't add anything because adding would make it a story. They put me in a small room with a bed and a window that showed sky without a horizon. They dosed me again and watched until the dose made my breath meet itself reliably. In those hours, the building sealed level 7. It cut. It isolated. It told everyone who did not get paid extra to worry that a minor maintenance operation was ongoing. Voss sent me a message that said, "You did the hardest thing. Morrison sent me nothing." Fletcher sat and read a book with a spine you could have used to measure thickness on a drill press. Lynette changed my bracelet when the first one printed my name wrong. I slept. Sleep reclaimed some stretch of hours and did not return them undistorted. In a dream that felt like no dream at all, I stood at the gate and watched the seam widen, and watched a hand that was not a hand reach for mine and stop because I did not move to meet it. The hand had my scar on the second knuckle where I had slipped with a box cutter. It did not touch me. It did not need to for me to feel the tug in the tendons and the old ache in the palm. When I woke, the window still showed sky without horizon. My bracelet spelled my name correctly. The mirror reflected my face on time. My phone vibrated on the nightstand with a message from a sender it had no path to resolve. Deborah Chu. The subject line read, "You lived." The body read, "For now." I wanted to say that we closed the gate and buried it, and that the living world resumed a schedule I could map without lying. I wanted to say that in the months that followed, the lag subsided completely, and the knocks became the building's harmless ticks, and the 3 lines never appeared again on any plot in any quiet room. It almost went like that. We sealed level 7 tighter. We moved suites. We reassigned. We wrote reports that replaced nouns with the unit and verbs with "was observed." We stopped feeding the dish. The old ham on the hill wrote nothing more in his notebook. Voss took a job in a different building that pretended to be dull. Harvey retired a 3rd time and bought a motorcycle that scared him and therefore made him feel young. Morrison got an award you could hang on a wall. Lynette left a paper cup on my table once and smiled when she saw that I knew better now. Fletcher told me I was stabilized. Kincaid thanked me in a hallway for not making us choose between you and a policy. She didn't touch my arm. She didn't have to. The thanks moved between us like a current that needed no wire. And yet, some mornings when I brushed my teeth and looked at my face, I watched a tiny delay reassert itself like a habit I had refused to break. My mouth completed a movement after my throat decided to swallow. Some nights, when my apartment settled around me like an animal that had decided I wasn't a threat, the knock came at my door. 2 short, 1 held. It never came when I had guests. It came when I had told myself I would not listen. I learned to hear it as a test that I didn't have to pass or fail. I learned to put my hand on the door and not open it, and feel the echo arrive on time. I stopped drawing the symbol on my palm. The skin there stopped itching for a pen. Still, on crisp mornings when the oven door's glass fogged in a circle, the fog left 3 curved gaps that didn't belong to the way a kitchen works. I would wipe the glass and tell myself the lint was the cause. I would put the kettle on and not wait for it. I would catch my reflection speaking to me a fraction later and say, out loud so I could hear the absurdity of it, I don't know if we were the villains or the allies in that room. I don't know if letting the gate keep its breath saved anyone. I can't tell you that our caution was noble, and I won't tell you our curiosity was evil. I am a man who counted things in rooms and tried to make the numbers tell the truth, and then learned my eyes needed a rail to keep them from sliding into a place that had no nouns. Last week, a package arrived at my apartment with no return address. Inside, wrapped in the kind of brown paper we used when we wanted to pretend a thing had no origin, lay my recorder. The red light was. The casing had a scratch on the side it hadn't had when I last touched it. There was a note, hand-printed in a weight I recognized. L. Voss. No message beyond a time, written like a heartbeat. 8:03:17. I put the recorder on my table. I watched it not blink. I sat for an hour without moving and listened to the building breathe. At 03:17, the refrigerator motor paused when it shouldn't have. The neighbor's bathroom fan stopped mid-whine, the streetlight outside hiccuped, and at my door came a knock I won't dramatize. 2 short, 1 held. I didn't open. I counted. I put my palm against the door and felt the echo return when it should. That should have comforted me. It did. It didn't. If you're looking for a clean end, you won't find it here. I'm not sure ends exist. We just get better at naming the slope we're on and the grit under our heels. Some mornings I believe that the 3 curved lines were our own instruction to ourselves, written from a place we avoided because we listened. Some nights I believe we silenced a warning from a neighbor we hurt without malice. Most days I make my coffee, and I wait an extra beat before I raise the cup, because sometimes my mouth doesn't belong to me until the moment after. When I turn on the bathroom light, I try to make peace with whatever version of my face comes up to meet me. It used to be a stranger. Now it's me, with a small grace period. I keep my doses in a bottle labeled for vitamins, and I take them more often than not. I keep the thumb drive in a sock in a drawer I never open. I answer no emails from the dead and most from the living. Tonight, as I write this, the oven door has fogged where it shouldn't, and the recorder's dead red eye feels like it's watching. If I stand very still, the apartment feels on time. If I listen too long, the hallway outside develops. Something down that long, well-lit artery knocks very politely and promises me a conversation in a language I could spend the rest of my short, structured life learning to misunderstand. I won't open the door. I won't swear I won't. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of this story. You're watching DR Vortex, home for mind-bending sci-fi, psychological chills, and cosmic mystery. If this is your kind of tale, hit subscribe, tap the bell so you don't miss the next transmission, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. See you in the next one.